Welcome back to AI Live. I'm your co-host for today, Megan Wright, joined by Sally Fletcher. And if you're only just joining us, I'd invite you to visit our networking rooms between presentations to take part in live discussions with your fellow attendees and our speakers. You can also visit our partner booths in the virtual exhibit hall to speak to industry experts and download free resources and white papers, which you can take home in your swag bag. You can access all of this from the menu bar at the top of your screen. In our next stream, we turn our focus to the workforce of the future. What will that workforce look like, and how will artificial intelligence empower us to get there? Let's find out. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, all the way from the Netherlands. Since early on in her career, and in fact since before the term robotics even existed, Aimee van Wynsberghe has been asking the questions that everyone else is afraid to. Questions like, should we really put our trust in robots? And if something goes wrong, who is responsible? And even, what does an ethically driven AI future look like? As co-director of the Foundation for Responsible Robotics, these are questions that Aimee now spends her time trying to answer. And she joins us today to shed a little more light on the role of responsible robotics for industries, governments, and consumers in the future. Please join me in welcoming Aimee van Wynsberghe.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Aimee van Wynsberghe. I'm an assistant professor at the Technical University of Delft in the Netherlands, and I'm also co-director and co-founder of the Foundation for Responsible Robotics. This evening, I am going to be talking to you about responsible robotics in industry as a concept, and whether or not this concept is a friend or foe to both or either the consumer and or industry. So really, the focus of this presentation, I'm going to address one specific question, and that is, in the current and future robotics revolution, how can we protect the consumer and or the user without stifling innovation? And really, this question has to do with balancing two interests. So we've seen often when we look at how technology develops in history, that if you try too hard to regulate a technology, this comes at the price of stifling innovation, even though the initiative was to protect consumer and user interests. Vice versa, we can also see that if you encourage innovation and really facilitate the development of innovation to move quickly and to progress, this has the potential to come at the cost of societal values. So for robotics, if we consider responsible robotics to be a different way of moving forward, what would this look like? That is essentially what I hope to talk about this evening. So before I get into the crux of the topic of this presentation, I wanted to tell you a little bit more about myself. I am from Canada, and I got my entryway into robotics at a Canadian institute called CSTAR. This stands for Canadian Surgical Technologies and Advanced Robotics. And here I was part of a very small team where we were testing the network variables of surgical robots. So we were training surgeons on the Da Vinci surgical system, but we were also testing how surgeons' performance was impacted by delay and jitter on this surgical system, as well as the Zeus telesurgical system. And it was really through this interaction with the technology that I started to ask about the ethical and the societal issues related to using this technology in hospitals. What did the nurse think? What did the patient think? How did the surgeon feel? Now that, as you can see from the picture, now that they're completely removed from the patient bed and standing over the patient body. So this led to my future work, where I was really trying to integrate ethics into the design process, into the design space. How can we make ethics something that's useful for engineers, and also that provides a tool to allow for ethical reflection on healthcare robots, as well as additional types of robots, service robots, for example. Now, at the same time that I have my academic role, where I'm giving lectures and presentations and things like this, I'm also co-director of the Foundation for Responsible Robotics. And this is a not-for-profit organization that's established here in the Netherlands, where I live and work. And really, our goal is to try and bring industry together with academics, together with NGOs, and with the potential future users of these robots to try and shape the future development. So to try and have a discussion about, do we need regulation? If so, what would that regulation look like? What should that regulation look like? And so on and so forth. Really, it's about paving the future of robotics in a responsible way and trying to uncover what that actually means. So going back now to the main question that I want to ask. Again, I repeat that it's looking at the balance between the benefits of industry and innovation, as well as protecting the consumer. How can we maintain both of these values at the same time? So in order to answer this question, though, it's really important to provide you with more background information about the kind of societal and ethical issues and risks that I'm actually talking about. What is present in the robotics and AI world today? So to begin, I imagine we are all familiar with some of the canonical examples, right? So in the press and in the media, we hear about dystopian pictures or worries that AI could be the end of humanity. We hear about robots in all of these different contexts, the hospital, the factory, and what it could mean in these contexts. And also, you know, interestingly enough, we hear about the personal dimension of interacting with robots. We hear about the risks to over interaction, right? What happens when you interact with a robot so much that you don't want to interact with a human anymore? Is it possible that you could fall in love with your robot and even want to marry your robot? And then, of course, this sets us down a conversation where we have to talk about whether or not robots would have rights and should be allowed or afforded certain privileges and so on and so forth in society. So there's, you know, a certain group of issues that we hear about in the press all the time. Added to this, we also hear about the risk of robotics and automation taking over jobs. And of course, this stems from some of the earlier research done by Frey and Osborne, which has been repeated in multiple countries by PwC, Deloitte, McKinsey. And they're looking at the percentage of jobs and tasks that could be replaced by robotics and automation. And of course, they present a pretty high percentage, but this is often debated. What will the actual number be? What will the jobs that are displaced be? So there's still very much a debate regarding whether or not these images will actually come to fruition. But what's also important as part of this conversation and as part of those reports that I was mentioning, it's not just about the jobs that are going to be lost, there will also be jobs that are created. And an important question is, who will these jobs be created for? We see already a trend in multiple countries, not just the UK as I'm showing here. We see that there's a very limited percentage of women that are representative of the engineering and technology workforce. So if we are creating new jobs in the robotics sector, in computer science, in engineering, to facilitate the future development of these technologies, it's important to remember who these jobs will be created for and how can we create a manner in which it's more desirable to have a diverse group of individuals working in these jobs. As we've learned, diversity is very important for a successful product. We've seen the risks of having a lack of a diverse training data set for training AI programs, which I'll get into a little later on. So what's also an interesting issue that we talk about in robotics is the idea that in the same way that Facebook, Twitter, Instagram might even be seen as a kind of social experiment, right? These technologies were put into society. Individuals are interacting with these technologies. There is no hypothesis really that we're asking, and yet it has become this kind of experiment. We're observing the negative consequences that are happening as well as some positives as well. But really, society, the real world, has become a kind of social experiment for some of these technologies. And now the question is that also happening with robotics? We can see some examples where this seems to be the trend, that robots are put in different application areas like the hospital so that we can test whether or not they bump into people, whether or not they can create a path to navigate throughout the hospital. So we're testing the success of the robot in a real world application. And of course, this is very important. In order for us to understand whether or not the robot will be desired and acceptable, we have to know if it will work in the real world. But shouldn't there also be some other restrictions or considerations? Should we be asking for informed consent? Should there be rules about the kind of data that is collected and shared and so on and so forth? And this is a particularly interesting and significant question when we talk about robots that are interacting with children. So this could be robots in the home, this could be robots in the classroom, or this could also be robots in the hospital that are specifically targeted at speaking with children. This raises issues about proper experimental procedures as well as privacy issues, sensitivity to data, sharing of data, or selling of data. So these are all in the world of ethical issues related to robots. Another issue that we hear about a lot right now in the media has to do with autonomous vehicles, whether that's a personal vehicle or an actual public transportation vehicle. And now this class of robots or technology really brings to the fore questions about responsibility and liability. What happens when something goes wrong? Who is responsible? Not to mention the question of how much responsibility do we want to delegate to a machine? This is an instance where machines are delegated roles in which they are potentially making life and death decisions. So this is a big, this is a big conversation and debate that needs to be had. And granted, we're just touching on this debate right now. This points at another conversation that seems to be happening. You may have heard of the trolley dilemma when you're talking about autonomous vehicles. Should the autonomous vehicle kill the one passenger or the 5 pedestrians crossing the street in front of them? The idea of, how many lives, is that how we make a decision based on how many lives could be killed or saved? And this relates to the idea of whether or not we should endow robots and AI and the algorithms with ethical reasoning capabilities. And basically the idea here is, could we and should we make a robot or an algorithm that can deliberate, that can calibrate between good consequences and bad consequences, that maybe can interpret different contextual variables and so on and so forth. So this is another issue that is talked about, especially when we're talking about autonomous vehicles, but also just robots interacting with humans in general. And yet another issue that is being discussed is the idea that people might overtrust these systems, overtrust robots, right? And of course, this isn't something that's new. This isn't something that we're only talking about when we discuss robots. You may remember the personal navigation systems, or for anyone who is a fan of the show called The Office, the main character, Michael, actually drives into a river. But the idea is that people trusted the technology more so than their own practical judgment. So they would see a lake or a river in front of them and drive into it because the navigation system told them to do that, rather than sitting back and thinking, there must be something wrong with this navigation system. So this is somewhat of a humorous example, right? When we can look, nobody was killed, nobody was harmed, but it's a silly thing to do to actually drive into the lake. But what happens when we're talking about more morally charged contexts or tasks that we're delegating to the system? So, for example, using AI in the detection of cancer, or using robots to remind people to take their medication or to actually give people their medication. What happens when we begin to trust these systems so much that we no longer question whether or not the system is making the right decision? So what's also important, this was an example of the different issues that are talked about, the different issues that add significance and relevance to the main question that I want to answer today. But another part that's important for answering this question has to do with some current examples that we really should pay attention to and to learn from. I imagine most of you in the audience are familiar with the Volkswagen scandal. And this really, this shows us that there are pressures within industry, right? There are pressures to make a profit. And this is something that we have to remember. Aside from condemning individuals for decisions that were made, we must remember that they have an obligation to their shareholders and so on and so forth. But this example shows us the tension between making or creating an economic benefit and the risks to transparency, honesty, environmental considerations, and so on and so forth. Another example that is good for us to learn from and to consider has to do with the company iRobot. And this is a robot that makes the Roomba robot, which is the vacuum cleaner that many of you in the audience may actually own one yourself. Now, there was a discussion happening not too long ago where iRobot wanted to sell the floor plan, so the data that was collected by the robot, to other companies like Apple, Amazon, or Facebook. And the idea was that this data could be used for the better functioning of the robot, but also to help with the products that these other companies, the Amazon, Apple, and Facebook, would be creating that would also go in the home. So there would be communication between the robots, but then of course, it is also left up to consideration what else would happen with this data. So this is a very specific design choice made on the part of the designers in industry, and it has potentially severe implications in terms of privacy and the whole structure of asking for consent, asking for permission to actually take this data. Do we want to be in a position where we don't know when we buy a robot exactly what it is that we're having enter into our home? Another good example for us to learn from was the Microsoft chatbot. And this chatbot was released into the public. I imagine many of you probably know this story also, but the chatbot was released online. And the idea was people would have quote unquote conversations with the chatbot on Twitter. And this would allow the bot to develop a kind of personality. I do personality in air quotations because does a robot or a chatbot actually have a personality rather than just sort of a series of sentences that it can regurgitate when called upon or when needed to. So very shortly after this was released to the public, the chatbot was determined to be racist, discriminatory, sexist, and so on and so forth. And this really had to do with the kinds of interactions that it was having with individuals on the internet. And now, of course, this was a targeted event. This was a group of individuals who deliberately were having this kind of conversations. But it's an important lesson for us to learn how significant training data is for the resulting AI algorithm, for the resulting product. And this is not an isolated incident, right? So we can't blame just Microsoft for something like this happening. We are seeing this trend. We are seeing that this is happening. And this goes back to something that I was talking about earlier, diversity in the workplace. We need to have diverse training data in order to have a robust resulting AI algorithm or AI program. So now that we have an overview of ethical issues, we have an overview again of adding relevance and significance to why this is something that has to be dealt with now, we go back to our main question. How can we protect the consumer and or the user without stifling innovation? So I'm presenting this concept of responsible robotics as a way of managing or balancing between both values. But then, of course, this begs the question, well, what does responsible robotics do? What does it actually look like? So we go through some examples of what could be done. And I have to say, this is not an exhaustive list. Of course, this is a 30-minute presentation, so I'm not going to present every option or opportunity possible, but I go through some of the the most contrasting ones so that you get a feel for some of the different options. So the first option could be, we do nothing. Right? We allow industry to promote and to protect societal values. We allow things to sort of unfold in an organic or a natural way, and we allow this to be dominated by industry, and we just sort of watch what happens. So this is one idea of how to do it. And of course, we can see there are companies like Facebook that have their core values, that have their business model, and that are very explicit that they try and promote societal conceptions of privacy and fairness and whatnot online. But in practice, what does that look like, right? We've seen stories now where their idea of promoting values isn't necessarily the way that other members or groups of society would like to see these values promoted, or it actually infringes on other values like fairness, like protection or freedom of speech on other individuals and other demographics. Not to mention the fact that because we have these values that really the bottom line is economic. So the promotion of certain values comes at whether or not this will promote an economic benefit. We can also see that consumers have a fascinating level of trust in these companies, or at least up until now they do. Almost a blind trust or a blind faith where they assume that the company is doing their due diligence. So when you hear about scandals, you take in the information, but you've also become so dependent on the technology because it's so pervasive in your life, and you assume that the company will understand that the information has been made public and do something about it, and so you go about your day. So there's an entanglement now of the expectation for companies to promote societal values, the understanding that the promotion of values comes with an economic consideration. So the value is promoted insofar as it brings economic benefit, and the lack of transparency between what the industry is doing and what the consumer understands or believes the industry to actually be doing. Now, of course, we do have some backlash here, and I was picking on Facebook in the last couple of examples, but they are not alone in this conversation, right? We could add Amazon, Apple, Twitter, we could add any number of large industrial corporations that are providing services these days to this conversation. And we can see now that there's starting to be a backlash. So in Germany and in the EU sort of in general, we see that fines are being placed on these large companies that really they're trying to demand a greater sense of transparency. problem is that we've gotten ourselves into a situation where, as I mentioned before, we rely on these technologies. They are so pervasive in our daily lives that it's almost near impossible to separate yourself from the political and the ethical questions and the use of the technology. If you decide not to use it anymore, there is an impact on your ability to achieve and to feel fulfilled in terms of the good life. So very much an ethics question. So moving on, let's look at another option or another choice about what could be done. Let's say that perhaps it's not in our best interest to have industry leading the way, because really their bottom line in terms of values is economics. So everything is trumped by money, right? So let's look at another option. The second one could be to create very strict regulation and policy for robotics and AI and development. And this is something that's very much on the forefront of minds of policymakers, of politicians, predominantly in the EU, but not restricted to the EU. Now, one interesting point when we consider this has to do with the temporal dimension, right? The speed with which laws, policy, regulation is created, and the speed with which technology is actually developing. So here we have a sort of imbalance that we can see technology is moving so quickly. By the time a law is actually enacted in order to regulate the technology, that original technology has surpassed what the law can actually say for it to do. So the law is almost rendered moot at the point that it's enacted. So this, this raises the question about whether or not there is utility in doing this. Is there any point in going through our traditional legal system and the structure of creating regulation and policy if it's not going to make a difference in the end, right? There are some other procedural questions, right? What form would such regulation, policy, or laws take? Should we be creating a ban on certain uses of robots and AI, or prohibiting their development to a certain extent? Or should we be encouraging other uses and development? And how? What would that encouragement look like? Would it be a sort of tax incentive from the government? Also, the scope of the technology. I'm in the robotics world, and I study robot ethics, and almost every question that I get at the end of the presentation is, what is a robot? And it's still up for debate. We don't have a universal definition. Sometimes you hear people say, you'll know a robot when you see one. And I mean, that's not going to work in the legal forum, right? That's not going to work when you're talking about creating legislation for these kinds of purposes. So how do we discuss the scope of the technology? And of course, in some instances, there is a blurring of the lines between robots and AI. When is it an AI and when is it actually a robot? Or when is it the AI in the robot that's responsible for making the decision? So the questions and the ambiguities go on and on for this question alone. Another point, or a procedural question, has to do with the timing of the regulatory action. Do we try and act, we would say, upstream in the design process, so early on, when you're starting to just talk about ideas or materials that you might use? And this is where people are worried that we could stifle innovation. If we create regulations too early on and your hands are tied and you can't develop anything, this really could be bad in the long run. Alternatively, you have the other option for regulation once you've made the product, once it's being used, and once perhaps it becomes quite pervasive. And as I was talking about before, once you have the product and you're using it and you see the benefits, then it becomes so much a part of your life. You become, I don't want to use the word addicted, but maybe in some instances we could say individuals are addicted to devices and other social networking platforms, but it becomes so much a part of your life that it's impossible to step back and to remove it from your life. So regulating it further downstream, we would say, maybe also isn't the best option. So we're stuck, sort of our hands are tied. We don't have enough evidence to support either time of regulation. So interestingly enough, though, we can see some clear examples of when it is beneficial to create a sort of prohibition or a ban. We have a classic example in Germany where children's dolls that have AI capabilities have been banned. And so these have been labeled as espionage devices or tools. And that's the reason for which they've been banned. And again, we're talking about a vulnerable demographic. So this seems like one instance where, yes, we can support this kind of ban on a technology. Another example of a technology where there's a strong agreement or movement in favor of promoting a ban has to do with killer robots. The idea of delegating the role and the decision of killing to a robot, whether it's in warfare or outside of warfare, but most predominantly warfare. And the reasons are multiple for this, that it could lower the threshold for going to war, that it allows for a very different conception of war that makes it just too easy to engage in warfare. And it already is somewhat easier than it has been in previous times. So there are some examples where it seems rather clear-cut that at least for the moment, there are enough issues to worry about that there should be a ban on certain very specific applications where it's an incredibly morally charged application in context and demographic at stake. There are other instances where there's talk of a ban and it seems less clear where the line is drawn. So one instance is in San Francisco, who's doing a wonderful job having a public conversation about how they want the city to move forward in lieu of robotics and AI development. And they have banned many robots from being on the sidewalk. So I think some companies are allowed to have up to 3 robots. And these are robots that are used for delivery of food and other items. And the idea here is now, instead of encouraging a sort of experimental flow and working together with the industry to create a ban that stops the research, that sort of puts everything at a halt. So whether or not this is a good solution or a good step at the moment is still, yet to be determined, to be decided, but it's one choice of one city in one country. Another conversation that's really gained a lot of attention recently is the idea of putting a ban on sex robots, because a lot of issues can be flagged where the robots can be seen as an objectification or an exploitation of the female body, especially when they have a very pornographic image or representation. But to put a ban on such a technology at such an early stage of the design and development process means that we would also lose out on the possibility to explore all of the potential benefits. So this is a technology where, if it's done right, you could have this used as a therapeutic tool, something that is used to complement one's therapeutic process for individuals that have undergone a sexual trauma, for elderly persons, for disabled persons who don't have the same access to a sexual partner that you or I or another individual in society might have. This could be an incredible benefit, something that provides quality in an individual's life. And to put a ban on the technology at this point in time would restrict the ability to explore those options. That being said, this doesn't mean that we should, allow the technology to flourish in any way, shape, or form, but there is some sort of oversight that is required. And how do we find that, and do we leave that up to governments, or is there another body that could be responsible for having a role in this discussion? Now, I should say, before I move on to the next option, it is important that in some instances, a ban or an encouragement or a limitation of some sort will be the right or the responsible way to move forward. But there are other examples of robots when it's not so clear cut. And then we're left, or we're put into a situation where we have to ask, what should we do in this situation? Now, in this third alternative that I'm presenting is a balance between the two previous ones. So this one has to do with the idea that we empower the consumer to make informed choices about the robots that they intend to purchase and use. And now, what I want you to sort of think of in your mind are some previous historical examples that we've seen, right? So talking about labeling food. In 2003, the FDA made it mandatory for industry to label the amount of trans fat in a product. And this had to do with the influence of trans fat on coronary artery disease and so on and so forth. So it was a preventive health measure, but also as a way of raising awareness and educating the public. Anyway, we can see that there was a trend that moved from, companies would label as part of their nutritional information how much trans fat was there. And then we started to see a shift that consumers were becoming more aware, were becoming more educated. And so they would choose the product that either had limited or no trans fat actually in the product. Now, granted, we should also acknowledge that in some instances, this became a kind of advertising and marketing tool that even if there was originally no trans fat, a label like this would be stamped on it, and this would become an incentive for someone to buy that product. So there is obviously always going to be the outliers, right? The industry that are using this as a tool to sort of increase their sales. But for the most part, the basic underpinning here was that providing this information allowed for greater transparency between the practices that are happening within industry and the kinds of products that consumers wanted to buy. They could now buy products according to their own set of beliefs. And we can take this example actually even further. So this is looking at nutritional information and educating and raising awareness, but let's look at something like fair trade. So fair trade is a movement where the entire movement is based on the protection of individuals, cultures, communities that were being exploited in the coffee making process, environmental protection, sustainable development models. Fair trade represents multiple mandates, multiple values, and is the manifestation of those values. They've also taught us now that when you buy coffee, it is an ethical act. Seeing at how communities and cultures were treated in the previous production of coffee, now you have an alternative choice. So not only is this educating and raising awareness of the public, but this is taking it a step further. This is telling the public, this is an ethical moment. You make a choice when you buy this product. So perhaps we can do that with robots, with robotics. And this, of course, isn't something that is restricted to these two labels or to these two movements. Even more recent research in 2017 is actually supporting the idea and the buying patterns of individuals, showing that 60% of Americans hope that businesses will drive social and environmental change in the absence of government regulation. 87% would purchase a product because a company actually supported an issue that they care about. So if we can see that these trends are already happening in the food labeling, in the purchasing of specific products where you're given a choice between an ethical version versus a non-ethical version, and the studies, the empirical evidence is backing it up, then perhaps this is something that would be a responsible way forward in the robotics world. So what might it look like? Well, we can draw on the different examples that we have, fair trade and the no trans fat movement. We would make this a voluntary program for companies, something also that an external third party has to conduct a kind of evaluation and a consultation process for how the development procedure has to go. You wouldn't want this to fall into the same categorization as corporate social responsibility, where it becomes up to the company to regulate and to conduct their own sort of research and determine where the assets actually went. You would want someone from the outside coming in that didn't have economics as their bottom line as well. And we might say that there was a kind of grading of the product. So in the same way that fair trade has a very clear rubric, environmental, sustainability, people first, for robots, you could have a similar kind of grading rubric. You could look at issues for environmental. So the development of one robot, does it take environmental considerations at play? Is that part of the development process, whether it's the making or the disassembling of the robot? You could look at issues of sustainability. Is there a sustainable development model, or is the success of this company dependent on you purchasing a new upgraded robot every 9 to 15 months, just as an example? We could look at issues about diversity in the workplace. So perhaps you're not interested in the protection of your data. You share everything, that's fine, you understand, but for you it's really important that you purchase products from a company that has a very strict and flourishing agreement or report, I'm searching for the word, that has a very strict commitment. There we go. Commitment to diversity in the workplace. For others, it could be that you choose a product that has gone through incredibly rigorous security testing. So the security measures cannot be breached, or it takes quite an effort and initiative to do that, or that there's a certain kind of testing that went into the development of this robot. And alternatively, you know, we do see some pushback with all of the data that's being shared, with all of the privacy considerations. We can see now a cohort of individuals that is starting to come together to say, no, we don't want data to be collected and shared in this way. So perhaps the robots of the future will have a certain certification or quality mark that is based on privacy and the data sharing and collecting processes. We could also look to something that's more universally accepted and understood, and these are the sustainable development goals. So these were decided at the World Economic Forum, signed off by 193 countries. These are the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. So if we're talking about the idea that robots will be quite pervasive in the lives of individuals, both professional and personal spaces by 2030, then this might be an intuitive way to go about the development. These are the goals that the majority of the world subscribes to in terms of how sustainable development should proceed. We have a technology that we believe will be quite prevalent and pervasive in our lives by 2030. It seems like a nice marriage, a nice fitting that we would develop this technology using this as our rubric or our baseline. But most importantly, what this does, this idea of a kind of certification or a quality mark, it facilitates and promotes transparency of the industry towards consumer. So in the same way that I was talking about what fair trade did, they made the shopping experience easy. They made it so that you didn't have to do too much additional research. You looked for this quality mark on the product and you knew, I trust this, I know that this is the kind of product that I want to buy. Or the labeling of trans fats. This was a way of showing what the industry was doing to the consumer. Secondly, it is a manifestation of collective responsibility within an institution. So the idea that the entire institution supports and promotes a kind of development that is sustainable, environmentally protective, adheres to a kind of diversity work plan, but that it's not just sort of 2 or 3 individuals in the company or a small section. It is something that the entire company believes in and wants to fulfill. Added to this, perhaps of equal significance to the other reasons, this kind of process for development would actually provide evidence and support for policymakers. So if we're in a situation right now where we don't know the kind of policy to go forward with, and there are multiple ways that we could create environmentally protective robots. There are multiple ways that we could create sustainable business models. So why would we choose one right now and then force industry to go down that path? We could create at this moment a situation where we have multiple ways to go forward. We collect evidence on their success, on the obstacles that they're facing, and then this could be used and provided to policymakers to sort of shape the future after 2030, that kind of idea. And really, this creates a kind of trust between the consumer and the industry. And I have in brackets here that it also has the possibility to erode trust. And this is important, right? Because if we know that we can't trust a company, it's not great, but it's important information for us to be able to make decisions as we go along in the future. Most importantly, and this is my final message before I sign off, the idea of this kind of certification or quality mark allows and teaches the consumer that purchasing a robot is an ethical act. And I think this is going to be the most important lesson that we learn as we go forward. When we talk about the kinds of uses that these robots have, the kinds of environmental impact they're going to have, the impact on sustainable development procedures, we really need individuals to understand that when you buy a robot, this is a choice that you're making about your value system. And if we can make it easier for you and show you the different values that one industry over another or one company over another promotes and wants to facilitate, then we've done our job. Then you get to make a choice about the kinds of values that you want to promote, and this will be manifest in the purchase of your robot. So I leave you then with that thought that buying a robot will be and is already an ethical endeavor, an ethical act. And I leave you with the idea in your head that it's your robot, this will be your purchase, and it's your choice. You should be allowed to make a choice. You should understand what this choice actually means. And there should be a a body, a representative out there to facilitate that for you. So this is the kind of work that we're trying to do at the Foundation for Responsible Robotics. If you're interested and you want to know more about us, the website is up here. Please feel free. We welcome new members all of the time. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to me today. And also, if you have comments or critiques, this is us beginning the conversation. So we welcome comments and criticisms. You can't move forward without having a friendly and constructive debate. Thank you again very much.
Thank you, Aimee. Remember, if you'd like to join in today's conversation on Twitter, simply use the hashtag AILive or follow us at AIIA_network. Please join us back here at 3:40 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, that's 12:40 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, for our next session, Harnessing the Power of Strategic AI to Transform Your Enterprise.